This is the hour of power, but the hour of power, I think we could safely say we have 23 hours of the day, other hours of the day. I used to go to meetings. It's really interesting. And I feel great during the meeting. I go there, I discuss my problem and talk to everybody. But the other 23 hours of the day, I was miserable. And I say, oh, I can't wait till I get to a meeting. I felt safe there. But we have, through these steps and this program, we have a better way. We have a way of being happy, joyous, and free 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if we're not, we have a way to get back to being happy. There are times during the day when I get upset, restless, irritable, and discontent. But man, I'll tell you, in a moment of inspiration, reading these steps, going to the big book, and any other things that I read, spiritual reading, it's pretty amazing how it all turns around. So let me start with the topic I have today. And the topic is, we can choose what we think. Again, we can choose what we think. It all has to do with this program. So if this is the whole key here. If you're upset today, if there's something bothering you, if you really believe this, and it is true, I can tell you by working these steps in this program and getting into that spiritual awakening, I can choose what I think. Now, if during the day I find that there is something bothering me, there's another alternative I have. I can realize the falseness in it. And that brings a few things. I jot them down, and let me tell you the first one when we start here. It says, society taught us all the delusions. Again, society taught us all the delusions. When I grew up and the things people told me, now, how about, let's go right to the addiction. It could be alcohol, drugs, with the food, okay? What they're teaching me, it's amazing. Every time I turn on the TV, on the internet, or drive down the highway, they're teaching me the solution is the food. If I saw a commercial the other day, and it's just had this music and the softness and made me feel of that, coming home feeling, right? So we made, and the advertisers and the corporations want us to think our higher power is food. If we have that food, everything's going to be fine. When I was in an alcohol addiction, alcohol also was my best friend. I knew I had a good friend. I have a good friend, or I know I have a good friend in food. But where does it lead us to? The devastation, all these diseases, all of these problems, being overweight, and the same with the alcohol, the destruction mentally and physically, because it's a momentary pleasure. And the food and all that's momentary, the pleasure. Pleasure lasts for a minute, and then equal on the other side. The amazing thing about pleasure is, on the other side of pleasure, it causes as much grief. Do you follow that? As much pleasure there is, it causes grief. Because when we desire something, when it's not there, then we have the feeling of we're missing or lacking something. And we put our emphasis in something that can never satisfy. And the more we get, the more we want. And it all has to do with, and the steps tell us, this whole program, and our addiction to food. Again, somebody said, well, let's talk more about the food. I can do directly related to the addiction with food or the alcohol. But we have a solution, and it talks about that no matter what they did in a doctor's opinion, they realized no matter what, that the scientists and the doctors at the time could not resolve this problem with the alcoholism. And the same, look with the food. Everybody here understands. And how many diets? 95% of diets fail because we haven't had that spiritual awakening, spiritual change. We can choose what we think. I always bring up the water. Okay. God's gift, right? Choose what you think. Do you want to think in healthy, or do you want to think in all of this abnormal, synthetic, and processed foods, which the corporations and society thrust upon us, even as children? Our parents didn't know any better. We don't know any better even now. I mean, we were children. Now there's no excuse now that we're grown-ups. Now there's no excuse why we don't go to something wholesome. When I eat, it's one ingredient in the food. The same with the alcohol and drugs. To be wholesome and righteous, these are the rewards we get, right? But when we're into the addiction and, the selfishness, self-centeredness, that all has to do with addiction. Addiction's in a material thing, food, drugs, whatever it is. We're looking for the happiness outside, because God created us, and the happiness and the joy are inside of us. The idea of God is in every man, woman, and child. We were created that way. But what is step 4? The defects of character, keep out the sunlight of the spirit. All of these, this thinking, so we can choose what we think. Either, as much as we're upset, say you're upset this morning, you're in fear of something you have to do. As much as you're in fear of being upset, you can just, by doing this work and doing these steps and bringing a higher consciousness in, it's just amazing. You can have as much in relation, be blissful, happy, and joyful. Because, we just are made that way. Because when we get out of the self, when we really get out of the self, it's amazing. Just the joy and happiness comes in. And it promises us this here because it's talking about, and again, this whole thing with the food, with the addictions, with life in general, we can't do it. Okay, step 1 tells us, if we go right to step 1, step 1 to me really sets up the whole program. And basically, step 1 could be considered the whole program. I mean, again, this is a simple program for us complicated people. Step 1 said we were admitted that we were powerless over alcohol and our lives have become unmanageable. Now, let me just bring you to page 14. It's just reminding me of that. I had this here set up on page 14. And what it says here, this is after Bill goes through the steps. He goes through the steps on page 13. But to show you how simple the program is, Bill lays it out right here in one sentence. He says, simple, but not easy. This is page 14. A price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. Simple, but not easy. So when I wake up, if somebody here, if you're upset or you're in fear, you're fearful, what are you thinking? Who are you thinking about, right? We're thinking about the self, selfishness, self-centeredness. So when we have a human side, which is all about the ego, the self, the ego is going to the dark side and it's just taking us out of into all of this, the bedevilments, on page 52, it talks about the sentimental feelings, the anger, the frustration. That's all related to our ego easing God out, right? And we get that way through our addictions because the food, when I want to eat food or drink, what did I do? I came home. I remember I would come home, close the blinds, I would eat, I would drink, whatever it was, whatever your addiction is. My addiction, again, I always talk about people and being addicted to them and wanting people to like me. So my day, I could be 10 people at work. And if one didn't like me, my day was ruined, right? But, so, and even 10 things could happen to me in a day. 9 of them were excellent and good, but the one that was bad, that's what I dwell upon. So what we think about most is our higher power. So the topic is we can choose what we think. So understand this, and believe me, it's true. That was my spiritual awakening. I'm telling you, I was driving in my car and I was really anxious and resentful. Resentful is our number one problem, as it tells us in step 4. Is a corroding, thread, the fear, right? So what happened was, and I was resentful and angry towards somebody, and all of a sudden I just realized that I didn't have to think that way. I could choose my thinking. But also, the reason I can choose my thinking now is because, and it talks about this in the very beginning, the doctor's opinion on the 28, Roman numeral 28, he says, knowing the true from the false. And right after that, he says, the only thing I knew was my addiction and my old way of thinking. Step 3 talks about being reborn. I just talked about, now we're on to step 3, right? We could be transformed. Maybe I'll read from page 25, transformation, right? So if I'm upset right now, it's about our little plans and designs, about the ego. When I bring a higher power, when I bring God consciousness in and I go through my day like that, like I explained, I used to go to meetings. I was there, I could go to a meeting for an hour and other people said it too. I feel so good. I'm here at the meeting, but the only time I feel good because I was expressing my problems. I wasn't in a solution. When we get into the solution, we work these steps and we have that spiritual awakening, and it's really true. And we get out of the old self, the old way of thinking, and we become reborn. On page 63, before this 3rd step prayer, it says reborn, and it tells us why. What it's 3rd step prayer. Actually, we pray to God to relieve us of the bondage of self. It's all related to self-centered fear. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that was the cause of our problems. And the next paragraph says, our problems were of our own making. So now that I knew where the problem was, I could resolve it. So to choose my thinking became much easier when I realized the falseness of it. You know, I love that expression, worrying works, because 95% of things I worry about never happen. So if you're worried about something, which I used to wake up in like fear and depression and thinking catastrophic thinking, right? You know, but when we get that change, that perception change, that transformation, we change. And again, I just want to relate it again to our addiction with the food, because 95% of diets fail, right? Even when they have that television program where it's called the 600 pounder and people have that surgery, it never works. On the very beginning, they say 95% of this fails. You know, I went on a strict diet for a year through this program, right? It was called the gray sheet, but I was miserable every single day. So, you know, it just, if we're miserable, when it's never going to last. And the other thing is, the interesting thing is that when it happens, that we are get to our goal weight, why doesn't that satisfy us, right? Because that's a material thing. If I get down to my goal weight, or somebody does, so if we get to our goal weight, all of a sudden we're saying, well, okay, it's not the greatest thing in the world. Okay, it's nice. So then say, but I like the food better. But we need a design for living, a change, a perception. Our body's God's temple. So the whole thing comes down to God wants us to have this, not gloopy drinks, 1,200 calories. This is God's gift to us. The same when we go to a restaurant and they put all that sauces on all the food. No, I go with the grains and things grown from the earth, right? Fruits, vegetables, things like that. That's my way. And like they talk about in the book of Daniel, and those were gladiators back then, and they were very, very strong. You know, it's just totally amazing that, you know, they're showing today when people eat certain foods that are healthy, they could be very strong and weightlifters and things. And if you look into these things, you'll see it. So, but we have a real problem here. And I had the first thing I read, you know, I have a lot of other things I jotted down, but one of them was, again, about society. We grew up a certain way. We were told to have to be successful, right? We live in a very materialistic society. I mean, come on, face it. That's why we have so much depression and anxiety and all of this, because, you know, it's so easy. It's the low hanging fruit. Growing up in the society, you know, no wonder a lot of people don't go to spirituality. We did, and luckily we got to the point where we were so desperate, we picked up the spirituality. But people in poor countries, or people through the ages, billions of people today in countries have this religious fervor. Not to say it's not here in our country, but I tell you, it's harder, as it says, for a rich man, which we all are. I mean, we're just all so wealthy, and we can get all the food we want. We get all the shelter, material things, this society, and all of the material gadgets. I mean, why would I need a higher power when I have all of these other things, and all of these hobbies and you know, somebody just brought me a gift for my birthday of a drone. I mean, I could go out and have that be my higher power. I mean, all of these things, but it never brought happiness, because the more I got, the more we get, the more we want, right? The more we get, the more we want. And all of these things we get take us away. Why? Let me ask you this. Why do you think people who are very spiritual, like in a monastery or in Eastern religions, they fast and they go to poverty, right? Why do they do that? Because they realize the lust, you know, is one of the 7 deadly sins. So is gluttony, right? So is pride. Pride is the main one. But all of these things take us away. So they fast, right? Not to say that I should say anybody here should fast. This is something that, you know, God will intuitively let you know what to do. When you get centered, you know, another thing about being centered in our addiction to food and our compulsive eating and what other behaviors we have related to food is that when we get into self-centered fear, we get out of we don't feel our stomach. We get into fear mode, and then we can't proceed because the body has fear and it wants to resolve it. But when we get centered with a higher power and a higher consciousness, then we'll intuitively, as it says in step 9, know, right? We'll intuitively know. We'll be in a position of neutrality, as this 10-step promises say, right? Because we're centered. When we're centered, our bodies know what they want. How about, you know, people who would normally eat normally, they know their body weight sometimes doesn't fluctuate more than there's a 2 pounds, because there's a thermostat. But when we get into the self and the self-centered fear, when we say, "Oh, last night I had all of this food, and now I'm just we call resentment, anger, and self-recrimination." No, when we keep God and we bring God consciousness in, this has to do with our addiction to food, but it has to do with every other single addiction we have. It's all related. So whether it's with people wanting to please people, whether it's with the alcohol and drugs, whatever it is in life, it's all related to the self-centered fear. We'll be centered and know when we work these steps, when we pray and meditate, if you meditate on, feeling your body and just relaxing, your body will tell you either I'm full, or the body will tell you I'm satisfied. I don't need an external food or drug. And we can be in a room full of people and everybody there, we get these delusions in our mind because going back to this higher consciousness, these steps, okay, I'll tell you a story. I was at a meeting, this woman once shared, she goes, and she was very upset. She felt that, she says, I don't feel a part of this meeting. There were a bunch of other women there, and she felt she wasn't with I guess, with the in crowd, So to me today, I have those feelings. Just that's not my peace and serenity comes from a higher power. And you want to know something? When we relax and we get centered and we don't care, if I walk out of the house and I don't care what the neighbor thinks or people at work, when I do care, I'm in self-centered fear. I don't know what to do. But God, intuitively let me know. I jotted some things down here. This relates directly to what I'm saying now. But listen to this. This you'll get a kick out of. Okay, well, the first one says, accept people as they are, not what you want them to be. Okay, accept people as they are, not what you want them to be. But the second one, listen to this. It's related to what I had just said. You cannot make people like you, but you can be a likable person, right? So the whole problem is wanting people to like us. The whole problem is something external. The food, it's all about the same with our addictions. It's all about getting happiness and joy from outside, right? When we get into that fourth dimension, as it talks about in the big book, that's when we're out of the self. Actually, the self is the ego, easing God out, but we do have a soul, a spiritual side to us, which is happy. It's just in there because a child, when they're really young, you ever see children, how they play and they're happy and they're joyous? It's only when they started to take it upon their ego, their intellect started to say, well, I have to be unhappy because somebody looked at me the wrong way or somebody said something to me about the way I was dressed. So it really was our fault. We took it upon ourselves, right? So when we say we can choose our thinking, we can be spiritual in the real essence of a higher consciousness, or we can be into the self and the humanistic thinking. We have these six senses, and that's related to the food again. The touch, the taste, the smell. This is the human thing. We want all of these things to satisfy us, right? The taste and the cooking and the food. But we have, on page 85, they talk about the sixth sense. So this fourth dimension, the sixth sense, it's very possible. So then we can choose what we think. Let me just read a few more things I had written down here and the points that came up. So I have down here, prisoner of your mind, right? Again, when we can't choose what we think, we're prisoners of our mind, right? That's what happens to us. We just become imprisoned. And then also I have here written, we seek one desire after another, never feeling satisfied. We're looking in the wrong places, right? We're looking outside of us. The answer to all our problems is inside. And it's that different consciousness, that transformation, being reborn. And it says, can be free from freedom within our soul. Okay, the freedom is inside here. It's in every man, woman, and child, it says in the big book. Okay, so the infinite power. When I think it's finite, my self-will, my best thinking got me here. That's why step one says we're powerless, right? We're powerless over those addictions. We're over the food and over the thinking. Because look, everything you've done, think about it, in your life to try to control the food, everybody here, I know 95% of it has failed. But I'll tell you something else. The 5% of people who've done it by self-will here are miserable every day. Like I said, I did it for a year. So the design for living is what we need. The transformation, the thinking, that the healthy feeling, and that we want be invigorated, bringing God into our life, that spiritual essence of the health of the food. I mean, I have something else. I have an apple here too. I mean, this is what we're talking about here. Not, We were brainwashed. We were brainwashed by the corporations. Do you realize that the Food and Drug Administration, almost everybody on there is from the corporations? We don't have a chance. We got this addiction, but yet every time we go to supermarket, walk down the street, turn on the TV on the internet, we're bombarded by this. So we really need the force of a higher power, a God consciousness. That's the way out. The only way out, Dr. Silkworth said, is a spiritual solution. We agnostics, it says on page 44, if a better ethics or code or morals of life would have been helped us, we would have recovered long ago. It says, and it says there many times, we have to have a spiritual solution, right? Either make that higher consciousness everything, or it is nothing. Okay. You want to be in prison? You know, I told you, always tell you about this lecture I went to where the guy said he was giving a meditation lecture and he just sat up there and he said, with his legs crossed and everything, you know, it was like the real deal. But he said, you know, you can walk out of this prison right now. You can have that transformation because the truth from the false. It talks about that in Doctor's Opinion. You know, the truth is will set you free. The truth is our little plans and designs, all of these things we're worrying about. Again, worrying works because 95% of things we worry about never happen. You know, I thought this phrase the other day was like, I'm always planning the past, right? You think of what that is? I'm planning the past. The past is the past, but I'm going around still planning what happened in the past. And how about this regretting the future? I'm walking around regretting the future. So when we pray, meditate, and we get centered and we're in the eternal present, either God is everything, he's nothing. When we transform our thinking, when we could even accept, you know, we can accept our own death. And, you know, do you realize too, that when we mourn about the death of other people, we're really, you know, it's a sad thing, but we're thinking to the self, how am I going to go on? What am I going to do? I'm going to miss that person. Still, it's getting into the self. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have these human emotions, but I'll tell you one thing. I can be in fear. I could be in resentment. But as soon as I realize and knowing the truth from the false, I'll say, oh, that's just an old reaction I had. But the real thing is being God conscious and having the love, tolerance, and patience. You know, there's about 10 times in this big book where it talks about love and patience and tolerance is our code, right? It even talks that on page 67 in Sick Man Prayer, right? Looking at another person. And this transformation, you know, when I'm resentful, angry, it's all about me. When I'm upset about my own death, it's all about me. My ill health, it's about me. When I'm upset that a long lost love or somebody in my life, you know, it was amazing. I would have these things happen. And sometimes, you know, I'm talking about, you know, big events in your life, losing a job, whatever it is. But I would have a small thing happen to me in my life and think about it 20, 30 years later. That's why step 2 says we had to be restored to sanity. How insane is that? And you know, we're all that way. But we now, when we bring God in a God consciousness and work these steps, having had that spiritual awakening, being, you know, reborn, and it talks about that, you know, the third step prayer, you know what the problem thing is? We're either in the problem or in the solution. But I want to say something. How many times have I read the third step prayer and didn't even understand? It goes in one ear and out the other. I never brought it into my heart. How many times have I gone through these steps? You know, I hear somebody would say, oh, I went through the steps like 5 different times. I've been in the program 30 years, right? And then, but when they go to a meeting and they start talking about the self. Do you realize when we talk about our problems, we're making them more real? If I say to you, my brother-in-law, my mother-in-law, my spouse is an issue in my life, I'm making it a real, I'm making it a real problem. What does step 4 say? The inventory is ours. You know, I made a decision that when I was younger, that everything had to do with other people and their problems. And when I did that, when they looked at me the wrong way, they said negative things, I got insulted and upset. So I had to retaliate. I had to, you know, to get back, get even, you know. Hey, look, this whole program is about love and tolerance. If you really want to get even with somebody, just love them. That's all, you know, that's the whole key here. Just love them. So the whole key is that the transformation again with the addiction. And I said this is for overeaters and alcoholics, but you know, I'll tell you something with the food, at 75% of our country is overweight or obese, right? But you know, this addiction and the devastating points about it is even sometimes I would go to doctor's appointments and they just, you know, the scientists and even what's his name said that Dr. Silkworth said they don't understand how many times they don't really look. This is worse than cigarette smoking was. But why? Because of the corporations and money all through the 50s until the early 60s, they didn't even address the issue. The medical people were actually promoting it. I'm sure a lot of medical people you see on TV are promoting different types of foods. Okay. With, by the way, again, I always talk about this. The foods and the processed foods have 25 to 50 ingredients, and most all of them are poisons. They just are. A lot of disease and things that happen in our life, as you know, are related to our addiction to food. So how insane is that? I mean, we also hear a lot of us had the problem with drugs and alcohol. But I speak to a lot of people who've been in this program for years, and when they go to this food, and the beauty of it is the food they call the final frontier. If we get in touch with our obsession, our relationship with the food through these steps and through this program, if we can get that to that spiritual awakening with that, it relates to everything else in our life. Everything in our life relates to our addictions, and our addictions relates to everything else in our life. Because all our problems are related to our relating to the five senses, the things outside of ourselves. The whole thing is that we can have a spiritual awakening where we realize things in a whole different context, a attitude adjustment, seeing life differently, a new pair of glasses, right? You always hear about that new pair of glasses, having that perception change, right? Having that, it's just, a lot of people think this isn't true. I mean, they come to this, I see people for years, they don't want to pick up the steps. What I mean by that is they'll do them, but they just don't want to get that essence of what it's all about, giving up the self. You have to lose the self to find the self, to get in relationship with that higher consciousness through a 9 out of 12 times in a 12 step say a higher power. Let me tell you, it's so counterintuitive to think for a moment that our self-will with relation to our addictions, we want to take control. Even with people, we want to take control. On page 60 and 61, I love it when it talks about we want to be the directors of the play, right? If only everybody else would act right, if only everything was right, our life would be good. But step 4 tells us the inventory is ours. The whole thing with our relationship to our addiction, it becomes easier when we have the spirituality come in and we have joy and happiness. We have spiritual food. We don't need the material food. We have spiritual food, bread, spiritual bread, right? It talks about the bread of life, and even the prayers and the whole, it talks about that's where the happiness and joy comes into us, only through the happiness of a higher consciousness and a higher power. And step 4 talks about that spiritual awakening. Step 4 says, working these steps, I'm talking about step 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, and practice this in all our affairs. Remember, I said I'd go to a meeting for an hour, talk about my problems there, and I was miserable the other 23 hours because I made the problems more real. The spiritual awakening came when I realized it wasn't the other people causing the problem. And I always start out the meeting saying, my problem is Bob. Okay. I'm Bob, an alcoholic, whatever else, but my problem is Bob. It all relates to us. We are the authors of our problems. It says that on page 62. It says the problems are of our own making in the second paragraph. But what does it say on page 62? It also says the last paragraph gives us the answer. It says, okay, it's saying on page 62, okay, this is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. So everything we're talking about now is playing God. I can do it. If I only could figure out my life, everything would be fine. If only people would act a certain way and I let them know, I don't have to be fighting anyone or anything as a 10-step promises. I could be in that point of neutrality, not even swearing it off, not swearing off life and people and trying to control them. I could go to work now and be in a meeting and everybody could be against me and whatever it is. Like I use that example, that woman in the meeting. It didn't matter what people liked her or didn't like her. It didn't matter about anything. It just mattered if she bring God into her life and the joy and happiness, but the interesting thing is when I bring God in, and I change, the world around me changes. Not that I care if people like me, don't like me, or if I'm in the meeting, people don't like the way I dress or whatever. But if I'm going to get my happiness from that, that's a material thing. That's going to a lower level of thinking. And then people wonder, hey, I used to wonder, why was I so miserable, depressed, and upset? Why was I anxious? Why was I waking up with fear? Because I made everything about me. No wonder I'd be fearful, right? With that kind of thinking. But with the new consciousness, not to say again, during the day, I have those moments of being in fear, right? Being upset. But I realize the difference is I observe it now. You ever hear that? Like you look at something and there's like really two people here. There's the material side, which has to do with the taking that bite of food, the lustful, the sinful nature. God gave us this intellect, right? This ability to think on a higher level, but we misuse it. If you want to be upset about something, this is what you do. If you're in the wilderness and a lion or a bear is going to attack you, then I say be upset. Okay. If somebody's putting a gun to your head, okay, I understand that. But we misuse self will run riot. We misuse it in everything in our life. We misuse it can you imagine when a person looks at us the wrong way? That's when we get upset about. No wonder at the jumping off point. When somebody said something to us 20 years ago or 5 years ago or last week, we're ruminating about it. When somebody cuts us off on the highway, somebody said to me the other day, look, somebody cuts you off on the highway. Well, maybe they're in a rush to go somewhere, or maybe they had somewhere to go. How do we know? But I take it a step further. I say, what does it matter if they go around cutting everybody off and they cut me off? I can't get involved with their craziness and their nonsense. God bless them. Look, this step, on 66, the sick man prayer said, look at them as a sick person. Here's a man who's rushing around, cutting everybody off, jeopardizing his own, his life and other people's lives, and is nutty and has to go somewhere where he probably doesn't even have to be, or nobody wants him to be there the way he is. But yet it's insanity. So we have to have this compassion, understanding, and love for the person as a sick person. But no, we take it personally. If the same guy was in a hospital with a broken leg, we'd go there and feel sorry for them. But when somebody offends us spiritually, and we feel that they offend us, then we get upset. For what reason? Because we're into the self. This is the cause. We can that guy, and it said, I just read, we can get out of that prison right now. And I love this other quote I had the other day. We can't be taught something because we already know. Nobody can teach us anything. And why is that? We go to our sponsors and ask them. We go to everybody because God gave us the answer. We can go inside and the answer is there. We have all the answers to all our problems. It says 100 times in the big book, the answer to all our problems through these steps and the spiritual awakening. It's just there. When I get centered and meditate, the answer that comes out is that, it really doesn't matter. All these little plans and designs, they said, even when we get really spiritual, and a lot of spiritual people, they accept their death. They think, well, it's going to a higher place. When we get out of it, when I get out of Bob, and the emphasis isn't on me, and it's a spiritual, and I can see the world around me. When I'm in the finite, I want to be in the infinite, but the finite is false, right? The falseness in page 58 in How It Works talks about being honest. 3 times it talks about in the first paragraph. Honesty is knowing the truth. Again, the truth is totally that these things don't matter. It only matters because we made them through the ego, easing God out. We can be transformed in another way of thinking and being happy, joyous, and free. All these material things, billionaires, people on yachts, they kill themselves, right? The more they got, the more they want, the more they have envy, all those deadly, all the 7 sins, the envy, the lust, right? Jealousy, all of these things, those are going to drive you crazy. That's the insanity. Step 2 said we had to be restored to sanity. So step 3 gave us a way out. So anyway, if we read on page 63, it says the 3rd step prayer says, God, I offer myself to thee. Okay. So what more, do we have to even go any further? Okay. I have a partner, a higher power, a higher consciousness. The old self, again, anything I fear or get upset about God didn't intend that. A little child, they're just happy, joyous, and free, They say like a puppy dog also doesn't have this higher way of thinking. They say the best day of a puppy dog's life is every day, right? When we get out of the self, and you wake up and you don't think of all of this craziness and get into the selfishness, self-centeredness, all of a sudden you say, oh, wow, there's a sun out there. The day looks great. It's beautiful, right? We can see things. Then we become more awakening. Then we found the solution before we made people, we made drugs, we made food, or higher power. But that transformation isn't going to come from self-will. It's not going to come from this billion-dollar industry who's giving you all of this food, and they're telling you, and these little morsels of food, and all of this junk stuff, and telling you, I'm not saying you can't have a special diet, but what I'm saying is that when we try to do it, when we say, I'm going to do it this way or that way, or then when we do go off a little bit, we get remorse and self deprecation. That's not coming from God. It all has to be positive, and think positive during the day. Because when we're in fear, we can't deal with our addictions. We can't deal with people, right? If I'm in a meeting at work and I'm in the fear, right? And somebody says, the boss gets up and yells at me in front of all the people, or somebody else says something negative to me, my fear, if my ego comes in, I retaliate and I get angry and upset. Now I could just sit there and smile, right? It's just because my self-worth doesn't come from at these times. I mean, sometimes it does, but I have a way back. It does all these things outside of me. Those are the things that I thought were my answer. If people only liked me, right? If people liked me, my life, then everything would be fine, you know. And I was depending on the human. It will fail us every time. The human experience. We have to have that God kind. When we have, it's like the story a guy told me. He says when he was from India, actually, this guy I work with. He says, when the elephant walks down the street and the dogs bark at his feet, he has a lot of confidence. He's a big elephant, right? When we're spiritually centered, the strength and the confidence and the joy and the happiness, it's like if you just won the lottery, you found out, and then somebody called your name, you wouldn't care. But when we wake up and realize we won the lottery, we have this happiness, joy, and freedom, and self-worth and self-confidence every day, which we do. See, that's the truth. The other things, and you're in fear and depression, anxiety now, isn't true. It's not. All of this craziness, because when we get out of the self, we can accept, again, our own death of others, right? Again, it's all related to us when we're worried about, especially today, people, it's, if I could walk out of the house now and get hit by a truck, let's face it. I mean, this is the insanity of our thinking when it's into the self. We created this ego